Good afternoon, Japan. Good morning, Europe. Good day anywhere else in the world. And a very warm welcome to the workshop on combinatoriality and compositionality in apes, hominids, humans, and birds. My name is Nathalie Gonje. I'm at the University of Lisbon, and I will be the host and moderator today. So what is this session about? This session is about a special issue that we are making on combinatoriality and compositionality for the International Journal of Primatology, and that is the official journal of the International Primatological Society. And so this issue is being edited by Daniela Rodriguez from the William James Institute in Lisbon, Portugal, Michael Player, who is in Kles in Poland, Stefan Hartmann from the University of Bamberg, and me from the University of Lisbon. So what is this issue about? Well, it is about combinatoriality and compositionality, what each of these are and how we can distinguish one from the other. And so we define combinatoriality as combining different elements into larger aggregates with meaning. And so we understand that as something that is aggregational, as something that is associative when you combine different symbols or different gestures, for example, together. And this is something that is generally assumed to be shared with other animals and with other primates. Compositionality is often something that is considered to be exclusively human, and so we define compositionality as the combining of meaningful elements into larger meaningful units whose meaning is derived from its component parts. And so compositionality is something that can be understood as hierarchical, as linear, nested, or interactional. And the question is this indeed uniquely human, or can we find that throughout the animal kingdom and also within primates? And not only primates, but also birds. And so we have authors who write on that topic, who we have invited to write on that topic, and we basically apply the question of combinatoriality versus compositionality to three key players in the debates, which is multimodal communication, so the combination of eye gazing with certain gestures, with certain vocalizations. At what point does that become compositional, or is that combinatorial only? And also hominin skills and tool use. And then, of course, the question of language. And so that is what our special issue is about, and that is also what this workshop will be about. Scholars will be introducing their papers very briefly. And so we want to start by thanking the people in Japan from the Joint Conference of Language Evolution for providing us this space to promote this special issue and to tell the audience a bit about this work that we are making. We also want to, in particular, thank ProtoLang because this special issue started as an outgrowth of the ProtoLang 6 conference that I organized in Lisbon at Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation in 2019 already. And so this is still one of the outputs of that conference. And we also want to thank, and very kindly so, Professor Joe Setchell, who is the editor-in-chief of the journal. Thank you very much for providing us with the space for our articles. In the name of all the guest editors and the authors, thank you very much. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank the other guest editors. It has been a very nice collaboration, and it was very much fun to work with you on this. So thank you, Daniela, Michael, and Stefan, for collaborating on this. And of course, also a very heartfelt thank you to the authors, because of course you cannot do a special issue if you do not have authors, and we want to thank the authors very much. So what you see here is the table of content and the outline of the special issue that we are making, and this will also be the outline that we will follow today for the presentation. And so the format that we are following is that each of the guest editors will very briefly introduce the papers that they were responsible for, and then the authors have each of them selected one of the authors to present that paper. That will happen for around a maximum of 10 minutes per talk. And we kindly ask you not to ask questions during these presentations, but then after the presentations, there will be time for questions on all the presentations. And so in that regard, Daniela and Michael are in Japan. And so if you are in the audience in Japan and you have questions, please just raise your hand and then they will come to you, and we will figure out how these questions will reach us. And then if you are online at the Zoom, then just type your question in the chat box and then I will read it for you. And so thank you very much for coming. This is going to be a great event, and hello to all the audience online and on site. And also, before we begin, a quick note to thank our sponsors. As you see, some of these presentations have been pre-recorded, but all of us are also online or on-site live. We are just doing this just to be sure that we have the right internet connection and that we do not have too many interruptions. And so Stefan is then streaming these videos from within his computer. And thank you very much, Stefan, for doing so. And also, thank you very much for the Zoom that is being offered by the Faculty of Science of the University of Lisbon and by the FCT, the Fundação para a Ciência e Tecnologia, that is part of this huge network here, that is offering this huge network to put all of us online here in Portugal, which is the FCCN RCTS network. So thank you very much for the Zoom. Also, thank you for the Center for Philosophy of Science for financial support. And these videos and the entire workshop will also be made available as an AppEEL webinar on the AppEEL website and also on the AppEEL YouTube channel. So you can always go and look for records of this after. Okay, so let's begin.
So hi from Japan, where we will start with a pre-recorded talk of Evelina Daniela Rodriguez and Marlene Fröhlich on operationalizing intentionality in great ape communication, social and ecological considerations.
Hi everyone, my name is Evelina Daniela Rodrigues, and today I'll be presenting the work I've conducted with Dr. Marlene Fröhlich for this special issue that is entitled Operationalizing Intentionality in Primate Communication, Social and Ecological Considerations. Intentionality has been pointed out as a key hallmark of human language, so whether other animals can use signals in an intentional way and whether we can detect it has been discussed for many years. And language and intentionality don't fossilize. So to understand if intentionality has in fact emerged in language or if it is evolutionary older and shared with other animals, a useful approach is studying our closest living relatives. But we have an additional problem, because early definitions of intentionality involve attributions of others' mental states. And we can't directly access mental states, so researchers needed to focus on observable behaviors, behavioral markers. And one approach that became popular for anyone studying animal communication was having this graded system proposed by Dennett that allowed to decompose some of its complexity. So studies on primate communication mainly focused on first-order intentionality, so in which the signaler intends to communicate in order to change the behavior of the recipient. So built on these definitions, we consider the communicative act intentional when was goal-directed and voluntary. And to study intentional communication in primates, we would need to focus on communicative acts that would fit this definition. And for a long time, facial expressions and vocalizations were considered voluntary, so researchers mainly focused on gestures. And primatologists, when started to address this issue in gestural communication, they've realized that developmental psychologists had similar problems with preverbal children. And in fact, psychologists were using some behavioral markers that could be indicative of their intentional use, such as gaze alternation, persistence, and elaboration. And several decades later, primatologists started to adapt and looking for other behavioral markers that could help us to detect intentionality in primate communication, like waiting for a response, checking the intentional state of the audience, and adapt the sensory modality accordingly, etc. And to have an idea of how some of these markers look like in primate communication, we have an example here from Dr. Marlene Froelich, in which a chimpanzee mother uses a rich gesture to solicit an approach by her infant, and because she doesn't have an immediate response, she shows some persistence by repeating and modifying her initial signal. So the goal of this article is to review the current limitations in the study of primate intentional communication and suggest a reliable and holistic framework for future research. In this paper, we addressed 4 major issues that currently limit our ability to detect the intentional use of signals in primate communication. These 4 main problems are related with reliability, validity, consistency, and generalizability of intentional criteria used. Reliability has to do with reproducibility of results under the same conditions. So we argue that several behavioral markers currently used cannot be objectively measured by observers across all conditions. How observers access the intentional nature of communicative signals may depend on several factors, such as previous training, the information available about the study species and subjects, and observational conditions that may impact the certainty of their coding. For example, eye gaze is difficult to track in some primate species due to their dark sclera, especially in their natural habitats, where the visibility conditions may be poor. And then we have validity, that refers to whether or not the results represent what they are supposed to measure. Some situations in which behavioral markers are applied may be explained by processes that occur in an automated manner and usually involve low levels of consciousness or associative learning. For instance, a simpler explanation for gaze alternation might be that a recipient and a third entity represent 2 competing targets of interest for the signaler. And then we have consistency, that is about the variability in detecting intentional communication between and within signal types, like gestures, vocalizations, and facial expressions. For example, the most striking difference between signal types relies on the use of intentional criteria as a precondition to identify the signals. For instance, intentional use is part of the definition of gestures in great apes research, but not of vocalizations or facial expressions. And then within signal types, we also have some variability, for example, in the number of criteria used. For some researchers, they need to have at least one of a set of criteria present, and for others, several criteria must be present. And finally, generalizability, that refers to the usability of behavioral markers in a variety of circumstances. Here we argue that the usefulness of some behavioral markers may be specific to certain social and physical environments. For this purpose, we've constructed a flowchart that can help us visualize which behavioral markers might be used in certain situations, and we organized some of these variables and behavioral markers based on the moments around the communicative act, the conditions before, during, and after the communicative act, and also after multiple observations of the same communicative act. For example, regarding the signal types, there are several behavioral markers that are applicable only to visual signals, such as checking the attentional state of the recipient and adapting the type of signal accordingly, or using attentional getters to manipulate their attentional state. So these are not relevant when the signaler is perceived through other sensory channels like the vocalizations. And we also have other special circumstances, for example, gaze alternation, that is only meaningful only when a third entity is involved. There is also no need for waiting for a response, persisting or elaborating if the recipient immediately satisfies the signaler's goal. So in our example, if the infant had immediately approached her mother, the mother's request was still intentional. Recently, some colleagues have suggested 2 other behavioral markers that can be added to the classical behavioral markers that we mentioned and may help us in the detection of intentional communication. One is preparing for signaling. In our case, if the mother was holding something, she would need to free her hands before gesturing. And the other one is checking if the goal was met, if there was an apparently satisfactory outcome. But this is only possible after analyzing multiple observations of the same communicative act. In this case, this would be only after some examples of individuals using these signals followed by an approach of the recipients. And then yes, after an occurrence of this type, if it is immediately followed by a recipient's approach, together with other behavioral markers, this may suggest its intentional use. In the end, we highlight future research avenues that may help us detecting the use of intentional signals. So we conclude by saying that we should opt for reliable markers according to the general features of the study, like the species or environment. We should be transparent and define the intentional criteria used, and we can always use videos to measure the inter-observer reliability of this criteria. Then using a set of criteria instead of relying on a single criterion isolation may help researchers to overcome the validity problem. The challenge here is keep it general and comparable across studies, but adapting to the circumstances. And also we'll have some differences regarding the subject's biology, their social relationships and living environments that we should address in our studies. There is a recent framework, Strange framework, that invite the authors to evaluate their study animals for possible sources of bias, such as social background, rearing history, genetic makeup, and experience. And characterizing in detail our sample is the first step to understand the specific circumstances of our studies. So one way to account for variation is to use broader conditions in which only one of the behavioral markers for those conditions needs to be verified. For example, for a condition that the signaler acts with a certain goal, one behavioral marker such as response weighting or persistence or elaboration would be enough. We have now some statistical techniques that can control for complex confounding social and ecological variables. We just need to have a sufficient large dataset with repeated observations of the same individuals in different dyadic constellations and social contexts. Having into account the recipient response and flexible interactions between the signaler and the recipient, by integrating both perspectives, we'll have a more realistic picture of intentional communication. So to conclude, we should aim for general criteria that allow comparisons across studies, but we should adapt to the circumstances. And having into account the limitations previously mentioned and working with large datasets will allow us to include some of this variation in a valid way. And finally, we'd like to thank our mentors and colleagues for the insightful discussions on intentionality in primate communication, our funding agencies, and thank you for listening.
So I'll introduce the next speaker, that is Professor Katja Liebel from University of Leipzig, that will present a recent work for this special issue that is entitled Compositionality in Primate Gestural Communication and Multi-Component Signal Displays.
Thank you very much. And I try to get this to work. Right, so you only see the slides and nothing else. Cool. All right, okay. So what I would like to do is I will try to answer the question if there is any evidence for compositional structures in non-human primates, non-vocal communication, and I will briefly summarize the current evidence, but will mostly focus on some gaps of knowledge and also challenges, and hopefully suggest some way forward to study compositionality in non-human primates. So, as has been already introduced, compositionality is one of the key features of human language and describes the ability to combine meaningful elements into new combinations with novel meanings. And although many researchers are interested in signal combinations or longer signal sequences, so far there are comparably few studies that specifically investigate compositional structures in non-human species. And as Natalie mentioned in the beginning, these are mostly on birds and primates, and we have to limit this even more because these are only few monkey species, so the famous putty-nosed monkeys or campus monkeys, and more recently also chimpanzees. For non-vocal signals, there are some studies on gesture sequences, and here almost exclusively on great apes. However, so far there's no evidence that gestures are combined to create new meanings. So gesture sequences might simply emerge because the recipient did not respond to the initial gesture and therefore the signaler continues to gesture. Other studies have found that gesture sequences are means to fine-tune communicative interactions and to adjust to the recipient's behaviors. For example, it has been found for chimpanzees and for gorillas. But all these studies did not find evidence for compositional structures or the creation of new meanings, but it's very likely that such evidence only emerges if researchers study the combination of signals of different modalities or multi-component signals, and we argue that such an approach is essential to fully understand the origins of human compositionality, as language is also multimodal. And what I would like to do now is to explore some of these reasons for the lack of non-focus studies investigating compositionality, and I will address these 3 challenges. Okay, so first, regarding a multimodal approach, we have to differentiate between multimodal sequences consisting of signals with different sensor modalities and multi-component combinations consisting of different signal types of usually the same sensory modality. And there are a number of studies investigating vocal gesture combinations, and these studies found that there are more likely to emerge such combinations in case a vocal signal failed to elicit a response, or that combinations are more likely to elicit a response compared to single vocalizations. In a recent study, we have investigated gesture-face combinations in chimpanzees and found, like for the vocal sequences, the combinations were more likely to elicit a response compared to single gestures. But we have to keep in mind that we have only looked at 2 gesture types, and we found this enhancement of a response only for very specific combinations, so with very specific types of facial expressions in very specific contexts, namely affiliation, involving very specific individuals, as most of these gestures were directed towards the alpha male. So the current evidence suggests that non-vocal combinations increase the probability of a response, but they do not seem to convey different meanings compared to their single components. Again, we have to keep in mind that there are only few published studies so far, and the ones shown here are exclusively on chimpanzees. And this brings me to the second challenge, namely meaning. So because it's essential, we first need to define the meaning of the single components to see if their meaning changes when they're combined with another signal. However, unlike for the vocal modality, playback experiments and thus the elicitation of a response to such signals to determine their meaning are not possible, or it's really a challenge for facial expressions and for gestures. So we have previously argued that it's difficult to assign specific meanings to a gesture, as the meaning of a gesture might vary depending on the context in which a gesture is used. So for example, an extend arm gesture might be an invitation to follow, or a gesture to signal submission towards a dominant individual. Kate Hopeiter and also Elga Cartman, however, assigned either loose or tight meanings to gestures based on a recipient's response, so the consistent response towards a specific gesture type. And we think this is really useful approach to identify one or several meanings of a gesture. However, there are 2 more challenges to consider. The first is to define what a meaningful unit is. So to explain this a little bit more, for gestures, the studies differ enormously in the number of gestures they differentiate for one species. So for example, by Simona Pica found 30 gestures for gorillas. Emily Gentil and her colleagues differentiate more than 100 gestures. And this might be at least partly explained by the level of detail used to differentiate between different gesture types. So for example, when I perform a slap with one hand, is this the same, or is it a different gesture type compared to when I perform the very same gesture with both hands? And this is a matter of debate that is not really has not been resolved so far. Furthermore, gesture studies might differentiate gesture types based on their immediate social function. So for example, a play hit or an aggressive hit, or they might use the form of gesture to differentiate between different gesture types. So for example, an extended arm with the hand stretched compared to an extended arm with the hand bent. For facial expression, it gets even a bit more complicated, as there are often graded signals with no clear onset or offset, and there might be blended or mixed signals combining to different, hardly to differentiate signals. And finally, because we cannot simply use playback experiments for gestures and facial expressions, as I have just mentioned, we still know very little about what aspects of these signals are actually meaningful for the recipient. And this is so additional aspects of combinations that have not been considered yet might be meaningful for the recipient, and therefore might be important with regard to the meaning conveyed by signal combinations. This could be, for example, a change in intensity, how a gesture is being performed, or the repetition of a signal. But for the last minutes of my talk, I will focus on the temporal aspect of signal combinations. So, for example, there's no agreement across researchers regarding the time interval between two signals, and thus the critical time period when two signals are considered part of a combination or separate signals, respectively. And we know even less about the recipient and how large this gap needs to be that a recipient still perceives the two consecutive signals as being part of the same sequence. Also, we know very little if it makes a difference at all which signal type is shown first, as shown here for gesture-face combinations. Mike Tomasello and also other researchers have previously suggested that play phases in particular have some kind of meta-communicative function in a way that they signal a playful attention before, for example, a hit gesture is performed, which could otherwise be perceived as an aggressive behavior, as it's also used during agonistic encounters. However, the current evidence is mixed, as play phases are also frequently shown during ongoing play bout and not necessarily at the beginning of an interaction. And finally, at least to my knowledge, there are no studies investigating if the extent of overlap between a gesture and a facial expression is meaningful in any way or has an impact on the recipient's response. So I hope I could point to some of the challenges in studying compositionality in gesture and non-vocal communication with regard to studying multimodal combinations and their meaning, and also point to some of the ways forward. I did not mention this, but there are also some really exciting recent developments in vocal research using algorithms to detect temporal dependencies between signals to select elements that are more likely to occur together. And the advantage of such sequence mining methods is that they are not using predefined, often ambiguous parameters, which might be problematic or not even relevant for identifying compositional structures, as I have tried to demonstrate for the varying definitions for the time gaps between two elements of a gesture sequence. And to study these temporal aspects I have mentioned last in more details, we have just started a project on gesture combinations in chimpanzees together with Wendy Sendler from the University of Haifa. And I would like to use this opportunity to point to the fact that we are still looking for dedicated students. So if you know someone who might be interested in doing a PhD with us, it would be really great to get them in touch with us. And with this, I would very much thank you for your attention and all the sponsors who helped to fund this kind of research. Thank you very much.
The next one.
Thank you, Katja. So I will now have to introduce the next speaker. Bridget, are you there? Okay. Yes, it looks like. So the next speaker is Dr. Bridget Waller from Nottingham Trent University, that will present the recent work and the face is central to primate multi-component signals.
Today, I'm going to talk about a paper that we wrote for the IJP special issue that this symposium is part of, where we try to argue that the face is central to primate multi-component signals. So humans and other primates have evolved very elaborate faces that contain lots of information. And we tend to think of this information as coming from two different aspects of the face. So there are static features processed by the lateral fusiform gyrus, and these the static features can tell other individuals something about the identity of that individual. Are they familiar or not familiar to you? Is that a friend or not? Are they more or less dominant? And also social characteristics. Are they male or female? What age do they have? What sort of kin relationships might they have with others? There's also dynamic information processed by the superior temporal sulcus, such as where are they looking? What's their direction of attention? Are they looking at you or are they looking at another individual? Is whatever they're looking at, is it something accessible to you or is it something that you can't see? So that tells you quite a lot of information about the dynamic that you're having with that individual. There's also facial movement produced by facial muscles, which might tell you something about the motivation of that individual, their potential actions, or their emotions. And a term that's often used to describe this facial movement is facial expression. So our data on humans show that on average, humans produce about 71 facial muscle movements per minute during spontaneous human social interaction. So that's a lot of information. That's a lot going on. There's a lot of energy put into that behavior. So what we argue is that in all primate signals, where there's a visual component, the face is relevant. And what we mean by that is, of course, if there's information in the face about facial movement or facial expression, then that's going to interact with other features of that visual scene. So in terms of what the body's doing, what the hand's doing, etc. And we know from human data that when you pair faces with different types of body and vice versa, then that can change the meaning. So so what people see when they see that visual scene is something different depending on the specific combination of facial expressions and bodies. So faces are going to be important in that sense when facial movement is present. But we also think it's really important to remember that when there's a neutral face, this is important too, because when there's a facial expression that's not present, that's also telling us something. Why isn't that individual producing some sort of signal with their face at that point? And in some ways, you could argue that there is no such thing as a neutral face. A neutral face doesn't exist because if there is no facial expression, then that absence is conspicuous. Why is that individual not producing something at that point? And the point is that having this so-called neutral face is really quite different to the face not being visible, which needs to also be understood. So in simple terms, when there's no facial movement but the face is visible, that individual can see the other individual that they're interacting with. They can see other things, so their eye gaze is visible, which is extremely relevant and important in terms of that interaction. But if the face is not visible to the receiver, then that means that the sender can't see the receiver, and so that's a very different sort of dynamic. And yet, even though we know the face is important, and we know that it's particularly important because it tells you something about that individual's visual attention, our original studies back in 2011 and our follow-up study recently shows that only between 5 and 2% of primate communication studies consider multiple components. And we think this is a very difficult thing to do, so we're not judging anybody for this, but the fact is we're not doing it, despite the fact that we know that different aspects of signals interact with each other and are relevant and should be considered at the same time. So why do we think the face particularly is sometimes overlooked? We think it's to do with two main things. First, because measuring facial movement is hard. And secondly, because we feel that an emotional framework dominates how the face is studied and how the face is viewed. And we think this is limiting in terms of understanding what the face is doing in a communicative context. So why do we think an emotional framework dominates? I think this is generally Charles Darwin's fault, which is normally not something that people like to hear, but I think the way that Charles Darwin set up our approach to faces has limited us in some ways, left us with this legacy. So his approach was that he was very comfortable using emotional terms to describe people and other animals when they were producing certain behaviours. So he described this man as feeling scornful, this dog as humble, and this cat as terrified. And he was very open about this position. He felt that mind and feeling and internal state was automatically expressed through behaviour. In a way, he didn't think there was an internal state. He felt that everything was embodied, everything was out there. And this was his philosophical position. And as a result, he had a fairly reduced focus on the social function of behaviour in these contexts. So he had a very anti-Darwinian, anti-adaptationist view, which of course is slightly puzzling and slightly ironic. And I think the important thing to me when I look at these images is not what we're seeing in these scenes, but what we're not seeing. So where is the other animal? Because all of these behaviours are commonly produced within social contexts. So the fact that we're not examining that social context, we're not examining the other in these scenes means that we're missing something. And I think this is encapsulated really nicely by a quote by Nicholas Humphrey in his Consciousness Regained book back in 1983, where he said, expression of feelings is a form of communication, and communication is essentially a social act. It would simply not make sense for an animal to express its feelings to the air, to cry, to blush, to purr, or raise its hackles in a situation where there is no other animal present and ready to respond to it. The whole point of an animal's being expressive is to influence, presumably to its advantage, the behaviour of another member of its social group by bringing help, staving off attack, etc. And I think this really gets to the nutshell of what we think is missing when we are considering the face from an emotional framework. And it doesn't mean that I think emotion isn't important, because of course it is, but it's just one thing feeding into facial appearance change. So if we think of the facial muscle action, physiological changes in the brain and in the body, and then perhaps subjective emotional experience or motivation that's going alongside it. But it's just one of those mechanisms feeding into the facial appearance change, which then affects meaning and behavioural change in others, which I think is probably the most important and interesting thing about this whole sequence, this system of facial expression. So is there a solution? I think there is, and I think this is to do with why measuring facial movement is so hard. So your faces are very detailed, they have lots of very subtle information, and it's hard to capture, particularly in wild primate work where you've got animals that are covered by trees or other barriers in the way, and it's hard for us as humans to capture that. But it's also hard for us to understand or to measure faces properly because we have very streamlined processing mechanisms ourselves when it comes to looking at faces. So one of the solutions is to that we've adopted and we think is a really good idea is using FACS. So FACS was created in the 70s for use with humans, and the system is identifies the minimal units of facial movement called action units or AUs. Each AU is based on a specific muscle movement or combination of muscle movement, and the idea is this results in a standardized and fairly objective system, so you don't need to use emotional terms to describe faces, and you can capture that detail, you can capture that subtlety, and you can measure it and quantify it, which is useful. We've adapted this system now for use with other primates. We started with chimpanzees, and then we modified it for use with other primate species and then also domestic species. These systems are freely available on our website, and we certify, we have a test where people can certify, and then they can use this for their own research in whatever way they please. We've based these systems on dissection and intramuscular electrical stimulation, so they are anatomically based. We haven't done that for some of the more recent species, but in the early days, that's how we verified the system. So to sum up, in a sense, we're arguing that the face makes all non-facial communication multi-component. The very fact that we have a face means that even when it's not there, it's telling you something about that scene. So that should be considered as a multi-component entity. Whether the face is visible or not is relevant, of course, but it's still conspicuous via its absence. Thank you very much. This is my team, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this symposium.
Thank you so much. And we will move on to our next talk by Sylvain Spies and colleagues. And for that one, we also have a recording. No, live? We're live. Oh, okay. All right, then Sylvain, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you see the slides?
Yes.
All right.
Perfect.
Hello, everyone. Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Sylvain Spies, and I'm very happy to be here and to present our study on syntax-like structures in maternal contact calls of chestnut-crowned babblers. So let me begin with a brief background and some definitions. As you might know, syntax in its most basic structural form involves combining at least two meaning-bearing units, where the meaning of the to be compositional, the meaning of the combination is dependent on its components. We also find this in animals, as we have also heard before, and also in birds, for example, in the southern pied babbler, which produces two contextually specific calls, an allure call and a recruitment call. And when they spot a larger threat, they combine these two to a new sequence with the new function of recruiting conspecifics for mobbing of said threat. and the combination seems therefore to convey a new meaning that is derived from its components. Vocal combinations have been hypothesized to evolve when the efficiency of information transfer is enhanced by building on existing signals rather than generating new ones, and that the need for increased information likely correlates with social complexity, so that the more social and cooperative a species is, the more information conspecifics have to communicate among each other. Since humans also show a highly complex social system, the study of call combinations in social animals might offer important insights into the origin and evolution of syntax in language. Which brings me to our study species, which I would like to quickly introduce, which is the chestnut-crowned babbler, which is a roughly blackbird-sized passerine that is endemic to arid areas of southeastern Australia. It is a highly social bird that lives in groups of up to 23 individuals. They are cooperative breeders, so there is one breeding dominant female with offspring and the rest are helpers. And they have a rich vocal repertoire of 18 distinct calls. Anecdotal observations suggested that these babblers might incorporate syntax-like structuring in their communication system, specifically in a vocalization which we termed the maternal contact call, which we focused our research on in the study. This is a call that is produced solely by the dominant breeding female during the breeding season, and the call appears to play a role in recruiting partners and helpers and coordinate care at the nest, like bringing food. So the quintessential stem seems to be a series of strident high-pitched piping elements, which you can hear here, which anecdotally are often preceded by other elements which seem to resemble other independent calls or call elements from the babble repertoire. Most notably, these seem to be reminiscent of adult begging calls, which are produced in an allo feeding context, or by the first element of the so-called Piao-Pi call, which functioned as a recruitment and group cohesion vocalization over middle distances. These observations suggest that the maternal contact call offers candidate syntax-like structure. So in order to analyze maternal contact call for any syntax-like structure acoustically, we examined audio files from videos recorded inside nests of babble groups during breeding season. We extracted 236 maternal contact calls from 10 breeding females, and for comparison analyzed an additional 40 Piao elements from middle distant contact calls and 40 adult begging calls. We categorized and labeled each element and then extracted up to 16 spectral parameters related to duration, sound duration, fundamental frequency, and energy distribution. First finding of acoustic analysis showed that the maternal contact call can just consist of its core piping elements. However, we found that in 79% of maternal contact calls, they are initiated by one of the two other sound elements. In 21% of these cases, the starting element resembled an adult begging call. These variants we called therefore bagpipes. And in the 79 other cases, the starting element showed a resemblance to the first element of a middle distance contact call, the Piao, where we subsequently called these variants Piao pipe. To test whether these observational similarities would also hold up empirically, we applied cross-validated discriminant function analyses. With this method, we were able to pairwise compare the starting elements of maternal contact calls and their counterparts in individually occurring calls and test whether they can be acoustically distinguished using the extracted parameters. Since the here used DFA cannot control for repeated measurements, we could only use one call element per call type per individual. The DFA failed to distinguish between beg elements from maternal contact calls and adult begging calls, as well as Piao elements from maternal contact calls and Piao elements from Piao-Ps. Further, we wanted to test whether the maternal contact call is truly combinatorial and if the calls or call elements used in other contexts are perceptibly equivalent when used in combinations with the core piping elements. For that purpose, we performed 20 trials of playback experiments to 7 groups, where we played back naturally recorded versions of the combinations and artificial versions composed of individually recorded piping calls and adult begging calls or Piao elements from middle distant contact calls. We then recorded and compared the response of the babblers. The most common responses were maternal contact calls and beg squawks, both uttered by the dominant female in each group. There were no differences in frequency with which maternal contact calls and beg squawks were produced in response to natural versus artificial playbacks. Also, only 2 bagpipe trials generated maternal contact call responses and none generated beg squawk responses. This suggests that the babblers make no difference in perceiving either natural or artificial versions of the maternal contact calls. We further performed playbacks of the 3 variants of maternal contact calls to elucidate if and how combining the piping element core with the 2 starting elements affects the response of the birds. Our results showed that the babbler reacted differently to the different maternal contact call versions, both in frequency and type of vocalization. Again, the main responder to these playbacks was the dominant female of the group, and to simple piping, maternal contact calls, and piao pipe, females responded twice as frequent than to bagpipes, to which in most cases got no response at all. Maternal contact calls were the primary response to the playbacks, and only two piao pipes did they respond with back squawks. That playbacks of piping elements alone versus in association with bagging calls and piao elements altered responses, at least to some degree, suggests that combining calls or call elements alters meaning. However, adding a start element to piping call appeared to modify rather than change the meaning of the maternal contact calls entirely. In conclusion, with this study, we provide further evidence for syntactic-like structures in non-human animals by demonstrating that the chestnut crown babblers seem to flexibly recombine components of at least 3 calls together into larger call combinations. Whilst follow-up work is needed to further elucidate the precise semantic relationship between the individual calls and the resulting combination, this work is consistent with previous findings suggesting simple compositionality as a communicative mechanism in the combinatorial structure of animals. The evolutionary implication of this growing body of data suggests that simple structure combinations of meaning-bearing units may well be a key initial step characterizing the emergence of more complex compositional syntax in language. With that, I would be at the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sylvan. This is going very fast. We are already halfway our workshop, and so far so good. We have a video for the next speaker, Stefan. Please, can you make it ready? It's the one from Shelby Put. So the next talk is by Shelby. It is a joint collaboration on a paper on the evolution of combinatoriality and compositionality in hominid tool use, a comparative perspective. Shelby is giving the presentation, and then Thomas Schoenemann will be here later to reply to possible questions.
Hello everybody, I am Shelby Putt. My goal in this talk today is to look for evidence for rule-governed structures with hierarchical nesting in the archaeological record, to potentially infer the capacity for grammatical recursive language in our hominin ancestors. And what I mean by recursion is the ability to embed a structure within another structure. And this ability is limited by our working memory. It turns out that this is what is meant by compositionality. To put it simply, compositionality is the ability to form a meaningful utterance by combining smaller meaningful units using standardized syntactic rules. And compositionality is an extension of combinatoriality, or the ability to form meaningful units out of non-meaningful units. We know that compositionality as a mental process is an extension of combinatoriality because neuroimaging studies show that there is this core group of brain areas that are involved in both combinatorial and compositional tasks. Many of these areas that are involved in combinatorial functions of language are also active during tool use, which you can see here in purple. This means that hierarchical cognition is the result of a domain general system of the brain that can extend to other behaviors besides just language. This means that all those thousands of stone tools that were left behind by early hominins can now tell us something about their hierarchical cognitive abilities, which could then also tell us something about the evolution of language. We need a system that we can use to measure the hierarchical complexity of both tool use and language. Tetsuro Matsuzawa applied the linguist's tree diagram system to tool use to directly compare the quote-unquote hierarchical structure of chimpanzee actions and symbols. So how his system works is you describe a tool use activity in a sentence, where each target of the sentence becomes a branch, and complexity is then measured by how many nodes there are between these branches. But there's a problem with Matsuzawa's system if the goal is to directly compare the grammar of tool use to the grammar of language. Counting nodes to determine complexity is only useful for comparing the number of targets in tool use behaviors. It can't distinguish between linear versus hierarchical structures, so this system doesn't actually look at the hierarchical organization of tool use.
A solution to this problem is our gradational scale of hierarchical complexity of tool use. It needs a shorter name, I know. But it takes us from one end of the spectrum with the simplest types of tools all the way to the opposite end of the spectrum where we have tool units that are made up of other tool units that can function independently on their own, but take on a new function when combined with other functional tool units. Using this new system, we can infer the degree to which earlier human species were capable of hierarchical thinking based on the complexity of their tool use activities in the archaeological record. We can also begin to establish a timeline for the emergence of a cognitive system capable of compositionality in the human lineage.
The most complex forms of chimpanzee tool behavior fall under the category of complex compound tool use using our system. Because their tool use in the wild and captivity does not combine two or more compound tools towards the same end goal, it can't be considered compositional. What this tells us is that the last common ancestor that humans shared with chimpanzees was capable of complex combinatoriality, but likely not compositionality. Therefore, the cognitive capacity for compositionality must have evolved in the line to humans sometime after our split from chimps. But then the question is, well, when? The earliest evidence for tool use in the archaeological record are the 3.3 million year old Lomequian and 2.6 million year old Oldowan industries. So sharp flakes, probably used for butchery, were made by striking stones together. Neither tool behavior involves hierarchical thinking that extends past complex combinatoriality, like we've already seen in chimps, unless we interpret the use wear on some Oldowan tools to mean that they were using their stone tools to craft other tools out of perishable materials like wood. Once we get to the Acheulean tool industry at 1.76 million years ago, things start to change. The Acheulean no longer focuses on simple flake production. Instead, the goal is to make a large cutting tool by removing flakes from both sides of a blank. But what's important here is the combination of flake scars, which together form a shaped hand axe. You can think of a flake scar being equivalent to, say, a knot in a fishing net. A knot on its own has its own function of tying something together, right? Just like a flake has its own function as a small cutting tool. But you can only form a net by combining knots, just like you can only form a hand axe by combining flake scars. By the start of the Acheulean, there was already a separate process for producing a large flake blank to remove bifacial flakes from. And blank production is a simple compound tool on its own. So already, the Acheulean industry has met the qualifications to be a simple compositional tool activity because the assembly consists of multiple compound tools, the blank and the hand axe itself. The Acheulean also boasts the first direct evidence of secondary tool use. A bone barbed point that had to be shaped by a stone tool is dated to between 930 and 800,000 years ago. And by 700,000 years ago, Homo was using soft hammers to remove thinner flakes in order to create thinner hand axes. Soft hammers are made from antler,
bone or wood, but a stone tool is usually needed to make the soft hammer. So this means that the soft hammer itself is a simple compositional tool. Combine a simple compositional tool with the hand axe, which is also a simple compositional tool, and there is no question that the tool use activity involves robust compositional thinking. So what we're seeing is a continuation of ape-like hierarchical cognition at 3.3 and 2.6 million years ago with the Lomequian and Oldowan industries. And the first secure evidence of simple compositional tool use begins at 1.75 million years ago with the first Acheulean hand axes. And the first secure evidence of complex compositional tool use begins between 930 and 800,000 years ago with that first barbed bone point that had to be shaped by a stone tool. These findings support a continuous evolution of combinatorial tool use into increasingly complex levels of compositional tool use. And a continuous transition to robust compositionality in tool use reflects a continuous evolution of a domain-general hierarchical cognitive system, possibly the result of selection for enhanced concept integration processes and working memory abilities. So what does this all mean for the evolution of language? We can expect that the earliest hominins had the mental capacity to combine phonemes into morphemes and were probably capable of forming words, but they didn't have the combinatorial mental powers to combine words to form a novel meaning. Now, at least by the beginning of the early Acheulean, early Homo was probably capable of combining words in a linear fashion to form simple phrases. And by no later than the late Acheulean, they were capable of forming more hierarchically complex sentences, allowing them to flexibly communicate, maybe even tell stories. And this could mean that language has a very ancient origin indeed. And with that, I will end. Thank you all for listening. I also want to give a big thanks to my co-authors at the Human Brain Evolution Lab at Indiana University.
Okay. Without further ado, we'll go on to the next talk by Nathalie Gontier and April Nowell, and we also have a pre-recorded talk that I will start in a second.
Hello everybody, my name is Nathalie Gontier and I'm going to be presenting the paper on Combinatoriality and Compositionality in hominid skills that I'm writing together with April Nowell. April is at the University of Victoria in Canada and I am at the University of Lisbon. The goal of our paper is to write on combinatoriality and compositionality in everyday hominid skills and hominid skills. And so what we are trying to do in this paper is we are bringing together 4 different kinds of research avenues that have been pursued by scholars from within different fields. One of them is the chaîne opératoire thinking that is typical of classical anthropology and archaeology, where scholars investigate the modus operandi to make certain tools. The other one is ongoing research on compositionality and combinatoriality in animal and primate studies. Another research avenue is research on everyday human behavior and activities, and in that regard, April Nowell, for example, studies body ornamentation and how it evolves over the course of hominin and human evolution, and that is the part that she focuses on. And then what I bring into this paper also is hierarchy thinking as it develops within the field of philosophy of science. And so here we are trying to look into what the heuristics are or what the logic is of behavior and whether or not we can find algorithms in certain kinds of behavior. And so we are going to briefly go over these different research avenues. So chaîne opératoire thinking is very typical of archaeological and anthropological research, where scholars investigate the chaîne opératoire, the different steps, the modus operandi taken for tools to be produced and for compositional tools to be produced. And we are very inspired by this way of thinking, and this way of thinking has mostly been applied to study tools and tool manufacture, but what we want to do is we want to investigate the chaîne opératoire of more everyday kinds of behavior. In our study of combinatoriality and compositionality, we are also taking into account ongoing research in animals and in primates on the presence of combinatorial and compositional behavior. So classical examples by now are drawings. We find that in primates, but also elephants, for example, have been taught to draw. And also in our search for behavioral logics, we are looking into outside of the animal kingdom, how amoebas, for example, have been able to solve certain kinds of logical puzzles by, for example, escaping a labyrinth under laboratory conditions. And so the goal of our paper is to look into the methodologies that have been introduced by primatologists and archaeologists, and to apply these to the study of more everyday hominin skills, and not only tool manufacture or other kinds of complex behavior, but also behavior that is shared with other animals, such as walking and breathing and eating, for example. There is a behavioral logic to that. For example, when you walk, you have to put your left foot first and then your right foot. Breathing as well, you have to breathe in and out. You can, for example, breathe in twice or breathe out 3 times, but the 4th time would be very difficult. And then, of course, the question is behavior like this combinatorial or compositional? And then to find answers, I am bringing in hierarchy thinking. And so hierarchy thinking is something that is typical for philosophy of science, but also for different sciences. And so as I said in the introduction, combinatorial behavior we can understand as associative or as aggregational, while compositional behavior is typically understood as hierarchical, as compositional. And so, but then the question, of course, is how do we understand these hierarchies? And in that regard, I make a distinction between linear, nested, and interactional hierarchies. So as a philosopher of science, one of the things that I'm very interested in is how the field of evolutionary biology investigates evolutionary hierarchies. And in my study of that, I have come to distinguish between 4 different kinds of hierarchy thinking: aggregational, linear, nested, and interactional hierarchies. And one of the things that I study in general is the combination between hierarchy and causality thinking. Now, I'm not going to talk about that today. If you want to know about that, then I will refer you to my paper on that in the Journal for General Philosophy of Science that I published in 2021. But so the basics is that for a structure to be compositional, that structure needs to have some kind of a nested hierarchy. But let's look into some examples. Combinatorial behavior can be understood from within aggregational hierarchies. So one of the things that came out of sign language research with great apes and also research on teaching them Yerkish was that great apes are very able to combine different signs together, different symbols together, and this somewhat randomly. So for example, they can say give me banana, banana, give me, banana, banana, give, without there actually being some kind of composition. That was also the critique that was given by linguists at the time. The way that the signs are being combined does not show any kind of compositionality. But so we can understand it from within an aggregational hierarchy. But be that as it may, we do share with the majority of animals behaviors such as walking and eating. And in that regard, we can already ask ourselves the question whether there is some kind of hierarchy there. So to walk, for example, you have to put the left foot first and then the right foot. And to eat, you have to open the mouth, then you have to chew, and then you have to swallow. Now, this is behavior that follows a behavioral logic that is necessarily linear. First, you have to put the left foot, then you have to put the right foot. And this is something that happens over time. So over time, the combination of these different types of behavior brings forth a kind of a compositional behavior. And we can understand that from within linear hierarchies. Nested hierarchies are hierarchies such as the ones studied by evolutionary biologists. Genes bring forth organisms and organisms constitute species. And so what you get here is a kind of a nested hierarchy. And here too, one of the things that came out of this early sign language research was that apes were able to combine different symbols together into new symbols. So Washoe, for example, the classic example was Washoe bringing forth the signs water and bird in combination and then producing the sign water bird. And so in that regard, we can understand that as nested. Also, if you look into the evolution of weaponry, for example, the combination of a bow and an arrow together brings forth a new weapon. And then there are also interactional hierarchies. And interactional hierarchies is when elements are combined that did not have any association with one another to begin with, but then eventually become part of a new composition. So for example, if you look into sewing, then what you have is you have the combination of a needle and a cord and a fabric and a stitching pattern, and all of that together are things that probably evolved at different moments in time in different locations that are then being combined into an interactional hierarchy to bring forth a composition. And so what we do then in this paper is we apply this hierarchy of hierarchies to some examples, and one important example there is research on body modification. That is work being done by April Noel and a colleague of her, Amanda Cook. They wrote a very important paper on the subject for the Oxford Handbook of Human Symbolic Evolution. And so they define body modification as the use of cosmetics and personal ornaments, managed hair, tattooing, scarification, cutting, branding, and other procedures and alterations to the human body for culturally specific reasons. And so we are looking into what of these behaviors can be understood as combinatorial and compositional, and what kind of hierarchical thinking lays at the foundation of it. And so this is what we are writing on in our paper, and it will be published soon enough. And so in that regard, this is the end of our presentation. Thank you very much. And I also want to say that I have this book series, Interdisciplinary Evolution Research, and I'm always open to hearing proposals for new books in the series. And so now we are moving on to the next talk, which is by Michael Player, Ryan Lepik, and Stefan Hartmann on compositionality and multimodality in linguistics. And I think you guys are also going live, right?
Yes, we are. And I'm sharing the screen. Okay. So we've heard a lot about compositionality and combinatoriality now. In this talk, what we want to do is to take a step back and to talk about the concept of compositionality and the role it plays in linguistics. So the linguists among you will know much of the stuff that we are now talking about, but as many of the other talks, we are basing this talk on a contribution to our special issue of the International Journal of Primatology, which is geared towards a very interdisciplinary audience. And so we hope that we can help to clarify the concept of compositionality a bit and to explain a bit what linguists mean when they talk about compositionality, and hopefully to help clarify some of the discussions and to help clarify some of the debates around compositionality. Because on the one hand, compositionality is something that seems very obvious and self-explanatory, but like many concepts that seem self-explanatory, it gets harder if you look at the details. So first of all, compositionality simply means that we basically get the meaning of a complex linguistic unit from the meaning of its constituent parts. So if you have a simple sentence like the cat is on the mat, we know the individual words that occur in the sentence. And because we know the individual words, we can compute the meaning of the sentence without ever having heard the sentence before. This principle is often called the Frege principle after the philosopher Gottlob Frege, but it's disputed whether Frege or to what extent it
actually exists in Frege's writings. You can't find it verbatim. Some people say that it's implicit to Frege's writings. Others say that it was the philosopher Rudolf Carnap who influentially attributed it to Frege. But be that as it may, it has become a key principle in semantics and especially in formal semantics. And a typical prototypical formulation of the Frege principle can be seen here. The meaning of a complex expression is determined by its structure and the meanings of its constituents. This is rather obvious. What is often debated is the scope of compositionality. So, for example, in usage-based linguistics, in frameworks like cognitive linguistics and construction grammar, which Michael and I are working in, there is often the argument is made that while compositionality does play a large role in language, much of our everyday language use is actually not compositional, but rather idiomatic, because as soon as I utter a sentence that you've never heard before, it's kind of out in the world, and you associate all kinds of things with it, like the situation in which you've heard it, which entails pragmatic associations and so on. And from those complex knowledge configurations that we have about each and every sentence token or word token linguistic unit that is out there, it follows that in many cases compositionality is at least or the way we compute meaning is not fully compositional, but there are many, many other things that are non-compositional that play a role in our production comprehension of language. Compositionality has been discussed in many different principles, but there are considerable differences in how it is understood, as I just said, and in functional approaches, it is seen as a matter of degree. There's also a distinction between combinatoriality and compositionality, and this is the place, I think, where Michael is taking over.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So we have heard this specific distinction quite a lot in the previous talks between combinatoriality and compositionality. So combinatoriality means combining elements into a new sequence with new meaning, where the meaning of the sequence cannot be directly derived from the meaning of its component parts. In animal communication, for example, the Piao-Hack combinations of pudding-nosed monkeys would be an example, because we have two alarm calls with different meaning. When they are combined, they just mean let's go. So there is some kind of combinatoriality, but it's not compositional. Whereas landmarks of compositionality are combining elements into a sequence with new meaning, where the meaning can be derived from the meaning of its component parts. So red plus apple gives you red apple as concepts, and the same as in natural language. We have red, the word red plus the word apple gives you red apple, or the word czerwone plus jabłko gives you czerwone jabłko in Polish, or rot plus apfel gives you roter apfel. One thing that's important, though, when we too fast. One thing that's important, though, to mention is that we have heard this distinction so far mostly, but there are animal communication researchers who use combinatoriality differently. Namely, that it is sometimes only applied to phonological combinations, so where importantly the elements do not carry individual meaning. So, for example, birdsong combinations in songs, like in typical songs, they would be combinatorial because they combine meaningless elements. And some animal communication researchers would not see the Piao-Hack combination as an example of combinatoriality, because Piao and Hack have meanings of their own. So we do see that there's some kind of theoretical and terminological differences that we have to be aware of. Now we can continue. And this is a big question, compositionality and combinatoriality across species. And as Fishbein and colleagues say, the questions of whether animal communication exhibits even a primitive form of human syntax has sparked some of the fiercest debates in the field. Classically in language evolution research, James Herford expresses this kind of canonical view that no non-human has any semantically compositional syntax, where the form of the syntactic combinations determines how the meanings of the parts combine to make the meanings of the whole. Next slide. And here we have a fundamental difference between single units and combined elements. So single units are very frequent, as in alarm calls for specific predators, which we can see in a lot of different mammals and bird species. But combinations are the ones, next slide, that we have more of. Great ape gesture combinations are one interesting case of this, and Katja already talked about. No, back. No, back. Yeah, next slide. Okay. No. 10. 10. Slide 10, please. Oh, what's happening? Okay.
Sorry for that. I just wanted to speed up a bit because we are running out of time.
Yeah, okay, go to 12. All right. Go to 11. No, okay. Just only skip when I tell you to skip, okay? Right. So, take-home messages. Is one thing that's really important, Stefan mentioned, is not all of language is compositional. For example, pick the bucket, idioms, and metaphors and metonymies. So we should decompose the concept of compositionality. Next slide. One way of doing this is, for example, construction grammar, where we have different types of constructions, complex, simple, different kinds of combinatoriality. And Angus and Townsend recently have proposed something similar. Now just skip to the last slide. And there are lots of open questions for the role of compositionality in language evolution. So to what degree do other behaviors and cognitive abilities exhibit compositionality, such as tool making and tool use, social hierarchies? How does compositionality manifest in different modalities, and how do different modalities interact, like signed languages, multimodality, polysemiatic communication? Compositionality generally seems to be a gradual phenomenon, and this has implications for language evolution. So we need to decompose language compositionality in different ways, and this is also something we see in many of the talks here. Thank you very much.
Okay, sorry for going over time a bit. We still have to practice this thing of sharing each other's slides. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce the next talk by T. Mark Allison and Uta Reinöl.
Can you see the slide?
That looks great, yes.
Okay, that worked. Cool. Okay, so today I'm talking with Uta, who's in the audience here, on a talk based on the paper that came out in the Journal of Primatology in this special issue that we have heard about already. And the talk and the paper share the title Compositionality, Metaphor, and the Evolution of Language. It's possible that when we talk about compositionality, we're crossing the boundaries into combinatoriality, as some use the term. And so you can be aware of the boundaries or the fact we might not be using the term in the same way that you might be. So beware. We're going to be talking about the role of some things that might happen as a result of the development of compositionality in the period we call in the ballpark of where that circle is, as has been discussed earlier, somewhere in this obviously after the split with chimpanzees and sometimes before modern the split of modern humans from Neanderthals. It seems to be the best guess, but it doesn't matter so much for our purposes when this precisely happened, just the process of it. So we're going to argue that compositionality basically enabled metaphor to happen once it was available, and certain other criteria such as selectional restrictions on what. And then we'll argue that metaphor builds up structure that we see in modern human languages, in particular the grammatical architecture that's a key component in modern languages. So we see these steps. Compositionality opens the door for compositional metaphors, and these give rise to something called obligatory overtness. And what this is what we see here in these two kinds of examples. So I don't know if you can see this clearly, but we have literal optionality. So in English, for example, we can say everybody else arrived at the hotel on Monday, John arrived on Tuesday, or we can say John arrived at it on Tuesday. Both are good. Doesn't matter if you leave out the at it. And the same with the example on the right. I saw a lake beside his house. There was an island in the middle of it. Both are good. However, things get weird if you have a metaphor that's constructed with the same relational terms. So here we have everyone else arrived at the conclusion on Monday. So we've got a metaphor using arrive. And then if we say John arrived on Tuesday, it's puzzling. We want to think he arrived somewhere physical. But if you say John arrived at it on Tuesday, then you can still take that metaphorical meaning forward. And the same applies to the case of middle. There was always trouble with their group. John was always in the middle of it. It's great, but if you leave out the of it, things don't work so well. And we see this as being present, we would argue, cross-linguistically in all languages, and we would say throughout time, because we think there is very strong functional reasons why this obligatoriness occurs. So we find this even back in Sanskrit and work that Uta did for her PhD thesis, where we see overt and covert references for literal uses in Sanskrit. So let's look at the covert referent, where the subject is pouring ghee onto the middle, and you don't have to say the middle of what, because alter is highly primed from the context. However, when we look forward, we don't have such good examples from the Vedic Sanskrit, but when we look forward to Upper Brahmsha period of later Indo-Aryan, we see that there are examples where we're forced to use a pronoun, or the writer was forced to use a pronoun, it seems, in a situation where the referent was highly primed and the language would happily let you leave things out if they were literal. But here we've got a metaphorical use of middle, talking about a group of gamblers, and it's not a physical space that you can be in the middle of, but its middle is used metaphorically there, and so it has to be resumed with a pronoun. So it has to say sitting in their middle, couldn't just say sitting in the middle. He shines as if bearing, and so on. So we've got this obligatory overtness, but we would argue that this then takes us forward into the development of word order regularity. And that argument goes along the lines of the following: that basically you are required to express a number of items overtly because of, when you're making metaphorical constructions, because of this requirement that these metaphor driving arguments be explicit regardless of the information structural properties around them. And if information structure is driving the pragmatics of word order, this kind of arbitrary requirement to have these things expressed overtly from the point of view of information structure arbitrary leads to a routinization, we would say, of the word orders. So we get this kind of default word order patterns developing as a result of the use of metaphorical constructions. These then provide a launching pad for grammaticalization. And in her thesis, Uta describes one of these grammaticalizations, such as, in this case, the grammaticalization of this word madhya that we saw earlier into the postposition me in Hindi, where now it doesn't just require an argument when it is metaphorically used, but it requires an argument all the time. So we've gone from this usage-based requirement that's based on deep processing needs into a syntactic structural requirement. And we would argue that, basically recapping the story we've seen so far, that we go from metaphors to overt arguments. Overt arguments help us regularize order, and then in conjunction with that overtness, grammaticalization can lead to the development of pronouns from demonstratives, can lead to other word classes, such as the development of adpositions, articles, and adjective noun distinctions. And once those functional types are developed, we see also the development of phrasal structure, where you have obligatory arguments to these functional terms. And these larger phrasal structures then can develop through routinization of fixed word order, all of this being kicked off from the starting point of the use of metaphors that arose with compositionality. Thank you for your attention. If you want to read more or hear more about this, have a look at the paper.
Okay, thank you. Also, thanks for the perfect timing. And we go on to our last talk by David Gill, for which we also have a pre-recorded video.
Hello. The goal of this talk is to introduce a distinction between two types of compositionality, bare and constructional, to explore the distribution of these two types of compositionality across human and animal communicative systems, and to examine some of the implications of this distinction with regard to the evolution of language in general. Most definitions of compositionality, such as the one we see here, are of an essentially bipartite nature, making reference both to the meanings of the constituents, but also to the structure, the way in which they're put together. This leads to the definition of the two types of compositionality, whereas in constructional compositionality, the one we're perhaps more familiar with, the meaning of a complex expression is determined, as per the definition we just saw, both by the meanings of the individual constituents and by their structure. In bare compositionality, the meaning of a complex expression is determined solely by the meanings of its constituents, without reference to its structure. This distinction may be illustrated in the contrast between two ostensibly similar sentences in English and in the Riau dialect of Indonesian. In English, in a sentence such as to, the meaning of the sentence is determined by its constituent parts, the chicken and the eating, but also by the way in which they're put together, which tells us, amongst many other things, that the chicken has to be the subject and not, say, the object of eating. In contrast, in Riau Indonesian, all we know in sentence 1 is that a chicken and an eating are present in some way, but we know nothing about the relationship between them. The grammar is massively underspecified in this respect. In order to represent the semantically underspecified nature of sentences such as 1, we introduce the association operator, here visible at the bottom of the slide, which provides a unified representation of all the possible meanings of sentence 1, saying more or less that it has to do with a chicken and an eating. The two are associated in some way, but the precise nature of the association is left underspecified. Thus, whereas in bare compositionality, the meaning of a complex expression is determined by the association operator alone, in constructional compositionality, the meaning of a complex expression is determined both by the association operator and by further grammatical constraints. Bare compositionality is thus simpler, constructional compositionality more complex, and this leads to an obvious evolutionary hypothesis, namely that bare compositionality evolved prior to constructional compositionality. In order to examine the distribution of bare and constructional compositionality across a variety of human and animal communicative systems, we need to develop a more fine-grained typology of compositionality, focusing on a number of different subtypes of constructional compositionality as indicated in the slide currently in front of us. First, within constructional compositionality, we distinguish between two subtypes depending on whether the constitutive element is a grammatical marker, indicated here with G, or alternatively, a configurational marker such as repetition or linear order, indicated with C. Cross-cutting the distinction between grammatical and configurational compositionality is a distinction between simple compositionality and relational compositionality, in which the grammatical or configurational marker stands in a specified relationship to the other constituent or constituents in the construction as a whole. Moreover, within relational compositionality, we can further distinguish between monovalent and bivalent cases as indicated in the table. What we end up with then are a number of distinct trajectories, from bare to constructional compositionality and from simple to relational compositionality. These trajectories may be interpreted both architecturally, in terms of a transition from simpler to more complex, and also evolutionarily. Well, so far, all of this has been rather abstract. In the remainder of this talk, what I would like to do is to flesh out and exemplify the typology by presenting examples of each of the different types and subtypes of compositionality from both human and animal communicative systems. We begin with bare compositionality. We've already seen the example from Indonesian. Other examples of bare compositionality can be found in the artificial languages taught to great apes in captivity and in the well-known waggle dance of honeybees. As it turns out, most of the instances of compositionality reported from the animal world seem to pertain to constructional compositionality. If we look at examples such as these from human languages, a noun plus a diminutive marker, an utterance followed by a politeness marker, we can find analogues to this amongst the reported description of female Diana monkey calls, where the H sign is analyzed as representing a socially positive relaxed situation, while the A affix marks the identity of the speaker. Moving on to simple configurational compositionality, and examples such as these in human languages, we find near identity between the function of repetition in at least some cases of human language and various instances of repetition in animal communication, such as in male putty-nosed monkeys, where repetition is argued as representing increasing levels of alarm. Moving on to relational compositionality, examples such as these of grammatical structures in human languages seem to find a close analogue in the calls of Campbell monkeys, where a call such as hawk is modified by an affix oo, indicating attenuation. Turning now to configurational compositionality, examples such as these from human languages involving configurations such as reduplication and intonation are matched by the call system of the Gereza colobus monkeys, where different configurations of the same roar distinguish between predators from below and predators from above, such as eagles. Moving on to bivalent compositionality, I was not able to identify any reported instances from the animal world of bivalent grammatical markers. However, with respect to bivalent configurational markers, examples such as these, in which linear order expresses thematic roles such as agent or semantic relationships such as attribution, seem to be nicely matched in the Piao-Hack system of male putty-nosed monkeys, where the hack is analyzed as being a modifier of the Piao. In summary, what we've seen is that almost all types of compositionality are present in animal communication, but much less commonly. What appears to be uncommon in animal communication is not so much compositionality per se, but rather its specific building blocks. Finally, the development from bare to constructional compositionality may have taken place independently on many separate clades, including within the relatively recent evolution of hominids. Thank you.
Well, we made it with some technical problems, but these are inevitable, but the majority it went. I just want to say that I think this was a very rich workshop, probably because most of these papers have already been written and published. And I must say that I am very, very happy, and also the other guest editors, of course, all of us are very, very happy with this special issue. I think it's a very important topic, a very important theme. And well, thank you all very much for coming, and the floor is open for questions. So we can do it either way. If you have a question, you can put it in the chat, or you can just raise your hand and talk to us. Comments, questions, complaints? One of the questions